Well, thank you, first of all, for inviting me. I know at least one of you has confessed to hearing a similar program I did for the St. Louis chapter a couple of months ago, and I think I had the pleasure of meeting some of you guys at the game in Bloomington, right? Anybody? Yeah, that was a good event. I hope you keep doing stuff like that. Uh, the As some of you may know, I sort of stumbled into this. I was actually working on what I thought was going to be a one and done journal article about a tournament in Decatur in 1867, and it raised so many questions that in answering those questions, I realized after a short time that I was in for a bigger thing. I guess, one question is, why study early baseball? Or if you're going to study it, how are you going to approach it? And there's only one other book that goes into a deep dive as to what was occurring in the state when baseball blossomed right after the Civil War, and that is Peter Morris's Baseball Fever in Michigan, which, like anything by Peter Morris, it's fantastic. What you usually see is somebody will come in and I'm not, these are fine books, but they'll say, okay, we're going to look at the New York Knickerbockers or the Morris Santa Unions or the Brooklyn Atlantics. And you get a lot of information about those teams or maybe that area, but there's not been a book yet on New York State, the whole picture. Why is the whole picture important? Well, there were some really outstanding teams, especially on the East Coast during that time. But does that really reflect how baseball was played, how it was perceived, what its ideals were, the problems, and what have you? Certainly, problems of obtaining playing fields. Now, some of that has been touched on in smaller slices in other books, but not like, well, what was going on in a given state. And so I argue that the only way you can do that is to look into that, which means you're going to have to crank a lot of microfilm. You cannot rely on newspapers.com. That'll get you so far, but a lot of these papers that were published during that time are no longer extant. I mean, they're no longer extant, but they're also not on online. You're going to have to go to the libraries and get them. And so it took me almost 10 years between the start of it and the completion of the writing and all of that. And most of that time was spent in research. So I'm hoping what will happen is that other people will pick this up, and maybe we'll see a book on Indiana or Wisconsin or Ohio or New Jersey. And we can start then with these little building blocks to get a real understanding of what that game was like. It was when it was in this sort of birth, and then, as I found in Illinois, a fairly rapid transition into something that wasn't quite what they had expected. I found over 1,000 plus clubs playing between 1865 and 1870 in Illinois. Now, some of those clubs were also found by the Proto Ball website, but most of them came from my own research. They were playing everywhere, if you know your Illinois geography, everywhere from Galena up on the Wisconsin border to Cairo, down at the very tip of the state, and from Danville to Rock Island, and in many places now that are no longer on the map. You have to really start digging around to find out where these places were. So there were more clubs in Illinois at that time than there were in New York. I mean, so what we're dealing with here is a phenomena that had explosive growth and wide public interest, especially for those first couple of years between 1865 and 1868. Well, so what was the nature of these clubs, and why were these clubs formed? And they're called clubs for a reason, because they were a club of people who enjoyed a common interest and wanted to participate in that interest. Just as today, you might belong to a book club or a pickleball club or a coin club, And what you want to do is participate in that. So most of these clubs, their primary purpose was not to play other teams, but to play baseball within the club. And that's certainly a carryover from the East Coast. Also, I would see these things, these clubs, as an early network building activity. You could, in this case, I'm talking about what I would refer to as adult clubs. Those would be people from their early 20s till about 18. There's also going to be junior clubs. We can talk about them later on. And then lower than that, something called pony clubs, different ages. So the purposes, I think, were originally just, recreation and outdoor exercise in what was considered to be a healthful, moral activity. And then it's going to gradually change as they say, well, we think we have a pretty nice team here in Bloomington. Why don't we play somebody from Springfield, or, a club from Springfield? What is always the danger in these things is that you would focus on the top teams. And there were 3 teams that I would rank as outstanding, given that for that period in Illinois. And that was the Forest City Club of Rockford, which we've all heard about. You guys know about that. That's Albert Goodwell Spalding Jr.'s club. That's the one that actually transitions from amateur to the first, the National Association, the first professional league. There was a team in Chicago called the Chicago Excelsiors, which was the most hated team in Illinois, even in Chicago. And that's an interesting story as how they got to that. And then third would be the Bloomington Baseball Club. And I list those 3 because those are the ones that actually went out and played other teams on their level. And we had, at one point, Bloomington defeats Rockford, Rockford defeats Chicago. If there's no leagues or anything like that. These games are haphazard. There's only a couple of tournaments, and those sometimes have interesting results. And here's the most famous one, of course, Rockford. You can probably recognize there's Albert Goodwell Spalding, who I used to like to tell my students was one of those people in history that the more you learn about, the less you like him. And that's another story too. So I'll save that for you. So what about the game itself? And it's a very different game. If we found ourselves on the sidelines of one of these contests in Illinois, there'd be a lot of things that would make us scratch our heads, and we'd probably be trying to interrupt the umpire to tell him, well, you're not doing this is wrong. Well, yeah, it'll be wrong by our terms and our rules today, but it certainly wasn't wrong then. So we'll begin with who played. Well, in the book, some of you maybe have seen it. Among the appendices is one that gives occupations for a small sample of players that I was able to identify. Largely, but not exclusively, they were what we might call today white collar or professional, or their parents were. But there were a surprising number of what I would call regular working people, a lot of bartenders, people who had political jobs, and even some farmers. Now the game and the players were expected to live up to some standards. This is a game that was as much about how you played it. In fact, I'll back up. It was more about how you played it than who won. Now, I'll repeat that. It was more about how you played the game, to quote old Grantland Rice. It was in this case, when the great scorer would come and mark against your name, he would mark how you played the game rather than whether you won or not. And the key figure in that you see there on the left is Henry Chadwick, and his book. He had several baseball guides. This is the 1867 model. This was Haney's. There's also one by a couple other firms. Chadwick was a sports writer in New York City who started writing about baseball in the 1850s. And he had lots of ideas, and he was also pretty much a reformer. and a big exponent of what would become known as scientific baseball. And so Chadwick's, he would push for these ideals, certainly in this reference book. And just a second here, I'm going to see if I can shrink this. Yeah, maybe I can't shrink it down. When we're done, I will show you. I have a copy of the. Oh, here you can see it right here. This is there it is. That's copy. You can see it's not that big. Most of this book is not about the rules. He has extensive descriptions of how each position should be played and the type of player, the type of athlete is best for whatever position. And he was a big exponent, as I mentioned, of scientific baseball. Well, what's scientific baseball? You play it with test tubes or what? No, it was the idea that the brain was as important, if not more important, than the brawn. You were supposed to, John McGraw would have loved that part of Henry Chadwick. In fact, John McGraw would have probably met Henry Chadwick. Chadwick lived till 1908. So it's what we might call smart baseball. But at that point, it's not so much about, figuring out how to manipulate the rules, but playing it in a gentlemanly way. For instance, there's this one quote out of this book says everything to me. Chadwick has all sorts of advice and standards he includes in this, and this is one of them when he's talking about forming a club. Don't elect bad-tempered men in your club. No matter how noted as players they may be, leave them out, for they will eventually do more injury to a club than benefit. Now, I don't believe, maybe some of you can tell me if I'm wrong, that on the general manager's office in St. Louis or Chicago, there's a plaque that has that quote. They don't care what type of individuals they are, as long as they aren't getting, arrested and thrown in jail. They can be foul-tempered, conniving people, but if they can throw the ball 100 miles an hour, or they can hit, 320, or they can run like the wind or whatever, there's going to be a space. This was a gentleman's game. That's how it's conceived, and how it is. They're going to aspire to playing that way in Illinois. Why does it explode? Certainly, in the coverage at the time, it sort of starts sneaking in 1865. Really catches on in 1866. In 1866 through 1868, editor after editor is writing about how this madness or this enthusiasm has seized our town. So it's not only the people that are playing the game, but citizens who are coming out to watch it. There's always going to be more people on the sidelines than in the game. And all of these people have one thing in common, spectators and players. They have no great experience with the game before this. There was a little bit of baseball in Illinois before the Civil War, but these people, for the large part, are people who come to the game after the Civil War, and that's when it really takes off as a spectator sport. In fact, there's an account from 1866 in Springfield where a visitor writes several paragraphs describing how mad for baseball Springfield is, and he actually compares it to an epidemic like the cholera, which was also going through Illinois at that time. So it was seen as this, we're sort of used to, now we've all lived through many of these fads. Remember the pet rock or the Cabbage Patch doll, or I'm old enough, you guys probably are, to remember the hula hoop or Davy Crockett coonskin hats. These are things that sort of we're accustomed to now. This was a big thing. There had never been anything quite like it. Now, a big part of this is these really aren't mentioned so much in this book, but they're sort of a unpublished set of expectations, and Morris is one of the first people to slap a name on these things. rituals and customs. These are things that a team is expected to do when you either go somewhere and play somebody, or especially if you host them. And it's a very elaborate structure, including, meeting the visiting team at the train, taking them for a meal, entertaining them, bringing in speakers, or having song fests before the game. During the game, spectators are expected to applaud good plays by whoever makes them, whichever team makes them. There are even reports that at the end of the game, the crowd doesn't cheer when the winner is announced, out of respect for the fine work of both teams. Again, that's very different. We would sit there, well, why aren't they jumping up and down and screaming? And how do we know these rituals are so important? Because when they're not practiced, the offending party's hometown newspaper takes notice and will say, well, those people over in Canton are really poor sports. Now, again, this is this early game. So now, all of you are experienced and knowledgeable baseball fans. I suppose one of the questions you're asking was how was it played? How was it different than what we have today? As you can see, this is the famous Currier and Ives engraving of a game at Elysian Fields there across the Hudson River from New York City. The reason why they had to go out there and play. And you can see this, I think this game occurred in 1866. You probably, I don't know, maybe your eyes are better than mine, but if anybody sees any player on the field with a glove on their hand, let me know. They didn't wear gloves. Now, another reality is in 1865, they had begun what was supposed to be a one-year experiment with the fly rule. And the fly rule simply says that to record an out, you have to catch a foul, a fair ball on the fly. Before that, you could catch it on the bound or in the air. After 1865, for a few years, you could still catch a foul ball on the bound for an out. Well, what this means is you're sticking up human tissue into the direct path of a ball that might be going 50, 60 miles an hour, depending on where they are. And as you can imagine, maybe you've experienced that, the result of that impact on human tissue is not necessarily good. So these outfielders, if you're going to be an outfielder, or I suppose an infielder too, if you're going to try and catch a line drive or a fly ball, you had to have a certain amount of courage. And Chadwick also talks about this in the book. There's only one umpire, and so you can see where the umpire is standing. And the players couldn't talk to him. He can only be addressed by the team captain. Anything else was considered a gross violation. And even the crowd was not supposed to boo or question his judgment. And basically what he's there for, he's not calling, in most cases, balls and strikes. You can see, based on his position, that would be difficult. If there's a disagreement, say there's a close call at first base, and the two players can't agree, the runner and the baseman can't agree if it was safe or out, then they would go to the umpire. And sometimes the umpire will go to a player and say, well, what do you think, sir? So it's a very different thing. Again, this is part of this gentleman's game. Chadwick goes on in this book as he identifies the position, and if Chadwick comes right out and says that the key position is the catcher, because the catcher is catching barehanded. Now they're not throwing. Well, this is I'm not going to use the word not. Frankly, it's very difficult, if not impossible, to determine what was going on with pitching. They had to throw underhand, as you can see, but it's pretty clear from some of the accounts, though they aren't detailed, that some fellows had learned how to throw the ball faster. Now, as long as you gave it what was considered a toss and didn't snap your wrist, but somebody must have been doing it very well because they were throwing curveballs, at least in the New York area. Uh, you could get away with it. But you can see the catcher standing behind. He's not up close. He's a little closer than he would be in modern vintage baseball, but still not quite like a modern player. He has no protective equipment. So a catcher's hands really took a beating because he's going to be trying to get those foul tips and a chance for an out. As a result, there's lots of injuries, mostly hand injuries. And again, there's a chapter in the book that talks about some of the things that happen. Usually it's going to be black eyes, busted noses, dislocated or broken fingers. In one case, a collarbone being broke. Now you can also see that picture is only 45 feet from home plate. So it doesn't take, a good line drive can do a lot of damage. That's how the fellow got the broken collarbone in a game over in Mount Vernon. Only a couple of fatalities. Those tended to occur in impromptu games, usually with little kids. And I spent a lot of time talking to doctor friends, trying to figure out what happened to an unfortunate young man in Ottawa. And he was running the bases after hitting what appeared to be a home run. There's no fences, so the ball was still in play. And he arrived at home plate just as the thrower arrived from the outfield and hit him in the lower stomach area and probably ruptured one of his intestines. But he went on home. Later in the day, he got sick and died a couple of days later. You also get stories of people getting hit in the head by bats. They're tossed around. So injuries was a problem, but not one to deter them. In fact, they sort of gloried in it. There's even a poem that ran in many newspapers at the time, sort of, bragging about how many bumps and bruises a player had. Well, as you can see, these folks are wearing uniforms because this is New York, so New York's going to be 10 to 15 years ahead of a place like Illinois. But we do know they were wearing uniforms in Illinois. I'll have some pictures in a minute. We've only got about 3 or 4 extant photographs from that time that give us some idea. The key thing were these clubs. Now these clubs weren't had to pay their own way. Now, what was important, so these clubs had to find ways to raise money for uniforms, cover their travel costs if they wanted to, say if Centralia wants to go up and play Decatur, or they want to go down and play Cairo, or they want to go over and play Mount Vernon. Well, how are you going to get there? How are you going to pay for that? If somebody's coming to your town, well, those rituals and customs, you have to show them a good time. You're going to spend some money on food. How do you cover those costs? Largely by dues, which is going to be their downfall. This was one of the, maybe sometimes you guys have had some of these things. You have a great idea and it sounds wonderful, so you try and do it. This is my great idea. I got an 1867 railroad map of Illinois, and as I found clubs, I put a little pin. The different colors don't mean anything. I should have had them all the same color, but what it does tell you, and you can see right here, here's an example right through here. Here's some more examples along through here. Here's another example here, and all over the map. The teams tended to follow lines of transportation, railroad lines especially, to some extent. And here we have, this is the Illinois River, I believe, along the, well, it's not there, no, this must be it up here. You see a lot of teams clustered in those areas. They weren't going to these games. I only found a couple of occasions where they went by horse and wagon. And one of them was a trip from Jacksonville to Winchester, which you can do in about 5 minutes on the interstate now, and it took several hours to ride. Imagine riding in a wooden wagon without seats, bouncing along on the prairie, and then getting off and playing a couple of games, and getting back on the dorm wagon and going back to Jacksonville. They also got pretty good news coverage. Thank God they did, or I wouldn't have had a book. Because quite often, most of the time, it would be what the equivalent to a box score or a one paragraph thing saying that Centralia defeated Vandalia, 35-10, and that's another story. Why were these scores so high? But occasionally you would get full-blown game accounts. Wouldn't it be wonderful if those game accounts had been written by modern sports writers? But they were written by what was called the locals. Most newspapers had two reporters. They had an editor who concentrated on big national political issues, and then what was called a local. He would have the local news page, and he would have some local political stuff. He had these like little 1 or 2 paragraph things. These guys were not experienced in baseball. Well, and they shared that in common, as I said before, with most everybody else. So they're writing about all sorts of stuff. Who's there, interesting incidents, things that happen. There's a famous game in Bloomington that I between Bloomington and Peoria in 1866 that I sometimes talk about. And forgive me, Jeff and others, if you've already heard this once before. But in this game account, people suddenly appear on base. You don't know where they came from. They disappear. You don't know what happened to them. People suddenly score. I don't know how they got on base. And so the most clear part of the story is some lines about a fat Englishman who apparently was drunk and wandered on the field and disturbed the game. And they finally got rid of him. And no sooner than he depart, then a goose wandered onto the field and got in the way of the play. And I think the shortstop for Peoria threw a baseball at it and hit it, and it ran off the field. Well, that's all very interesting, but trying to figure out what was going on in these games is challenging. Now, an example. In all the stories I read, I never saw one reference to stealing. But we know what was going on. How do we know what's going on? Because later in their memoirs, a couple of players will talk about the day their catcher figured out that if he stood up closer behind the batter and took the risk of the bat and all that, he'd have a better chance of throwing runners out when they were trying to steal. But you would think somebody would have said something about that in the game story at the time. So how much else was left out? So most of it is just about sort of the pageantry and the fact that our team won or our team didn't, but they all played, they parted the field as friends. They treat each other like gentlemen. Maybe they'll have a big description of the post-game banquet, which would sometimes go on late into the night. So all sorts of stuff that would not be in a modern story. What are some of the problems they have? Well, this is one of the things that really intrigued me, was playing space. And that could be a very contentious problem. Now, we take it for granted. You go out, wherever you are now, I bet you could walk outside your door and you wouldn't have far to go to a public park, which maybe has ball fields all over. There were no public parks. The closest thing to a public park was the courthouse square, and they had enough trouble with people playing baseball, usually kids, on the courthouse square, that they were, in some places, actually outlaw playing baseball. So they had to find open space. This is Bloomington's first field. If anybody's familiar with Bloomington today, this is now Bent School. And the northern part of the property is now full of houses. But this was an open area at Bent School, and it's called at that time it was called the Fifth Ward School, and this is where the Bloomington Baseball Club and others played. You can see it's surrounded by houses. Baseball players could be noisy and rowdy. The upshot was that eventually the citizens petitioned the city council. The city council, by a vote of 7-2, outlawed the playing of baseball within the city limits of Bloomington. Now, this was, as I said, the third best team in Illinois. It was also politically connected. Some of the players were either office holders or the sons of office holders, or who had become office holders. You got lots of young lawyers, what have you. One guy who would later become a professional for 1 year. But and even the mayor of Bloomington was a member of the Bloomington Baseball Club. He was one of the two that voted against it. Didn't matter. They kicked him out. They had to go outside the state limits. If you're familiar with Bloomington, roughly on the west edge of town where the driver's license station is now, that was the fairgrounds, and they played there. Contrast that with Springfield, which then and now in Springfield, clout, influence counts. And so this is a blow up of this area. This red line would have been the city limits. So this would have been referred to out here as West Springfield. What we have here is, it just says J.K. Du Bois property. He was the owner of the Capitol Horse Railway, which we can see coming, if you can follow my little pointer here. This was a horse-drawn railway, and this was as you can see, the end of the line. This property across the street, here's the horse depot. Property across the street is owned by Alexander Starn, who was the general manager of the Capitol Horse Railway. Now this would be today what is the west. Well, that's not the West End. This field right here, it says John Brown. If you're familiar with Springfield, I believe this is the old football field that sits behind Springfield High School. So the team, the number one team in Springfield, was called the Capitals, not because of the state capital, but because of the Capitol Horse Railway. If you're the owner of the Capitol Horse Railway, what do you want to do? You want to have people riding that as far as you possibly can. They got to pay more money. You can see how far out. This would be the center of Springfield, right around in here, way out on the edge. So what are you going to do? Well, you got all this empty space, this meadow. Why not create a public park? Not a publicly owned park, but a private park. And so this becomes Railway Park. It hosts their baseball games. There's not going to be any skinned infield or grass infield here. It's just all open space. They're going to have an ice skating rink there in the winter. They're going to have pigeon shoots. They're going to have political rallies. They're going to have picnic grounds. All of this is tied into commerce. This field, another team played there, and it was Brown is a Springfield city councilman. There's other fields up here, one in the south, which is donated by a prominent banker, Major Isles. One in the north, donated by a prominent local family named Enos, and it's now actually it's the only one that's actually a park today. And ironically, as part of the conditions when the family donated that park to the city in the early 20th century, was that baseball could never be played there. The difference is in Springfield, a lot of these, Springfield really embraced the game. Of course, it's a different, Bloomington was pretty much a Puritan, blue-nosed town. Nothing, couldn't do anything on Sundays. A lot of old Yankees were running the place. Springfield was more of a wide open place. Those are two examples, but this happens over and over again. Teams are always trying to find playing space, so that was a problem. Intercity competition starts out slowly, and in the first couple of years, there's not much of a problem. But competition is competition. And these towns, say a place like Centralia, would be a rival of Mount Vernon. They're competing for railroads. They're competing for commercial supremacy in their area. And there's just also, the whole we're better than you are thing. And so as they're, in the case of some teams, as they start to lose, they have become entwined with the public image, and that causes blowback locally. That's one of the things that's going to undermine the Chicago Excelsior. So that sort of puts a new edge on it. That puts a harsher competitive edge, because now you're not playing other gentlemen for the fun and the exercise and the experience. Now you're playing, in essence, for your town, which is something we would recognize today. I mean, I grew up in Mattoon, and there were few places we hated more than Charleston, which is only 10 miles away. Or imagine Champaign-Urbana, where they used to have cops at all the football games, between Champaign and Urbana, or to a lesser extent, Bloomington and Normal. So this intercity competition is one of the challenges piled on top of playing space, and then how do you simply fund these clubs? And then finally, professionalism. And the first blatant example of it is there's one of the things that undermined the Chicago Excelsiors was an 1867 game in Chicago against the touring Washington Nationals. The Washington Nationals were essentially not the ones today. This was, 1867. They were essentially professional. Well, were they getting checks to play baseball? No, but they were getting checks to work for the U.S. Treasury Department because they were good baseball players, sort of like fast pitch softball today. And they would be given time off to go to games and practice and stuff like that. In 1867, they come out and they beat everybody on the way. I mean, they humiliate Cincinnati, they humiliate St. Louis. It's like a comet going through the air. So they come into Chicago. They're going to play on the second day. They're going to play the Excelsiors. The first day, they're going to play this country team. That was a sort of a derisive term you would use to call somebody a country team from Rockford called the Forest City. And they had a 16 or 17-year-old pitcher named Albert Goodwell Spalding Jr. And in that game, to the shock of everyone, Forest City beat the Washington Nationals 27-24. Well, immediately, everybody was putting money down on the Excelsiors to win the next day's game. Well, gee, if the Forest City, this country club, can beat the Washington Nationals, the Excelsiors, who have beaten teams from Detroit and Milwaukee and everywhere else, they're going to clobber them. Well, what happened is the Excelsiors the next day were humiliated. It was a terrible defeat, and from which they never recovered. In response, they say, we've got to tighten things up. So they go around looking for the best players. They go down to Bloomington. They offer jobs in Chicago to two players, the catcher and then the pitcher, named Patrick J. Keenan, an Irish immigrant. And they also go up to Rockford and offer Spalding a job. Keenan and Spalding agree and go up to Chicago and play. Spalding was probably the best paid grocery store clerk in the history of Chicago. He just sort of said he worked in a grocery store, but he was there to pitch. We're not sure what Keenan's job was. Both of them left at the end of the 1867 season. But this is happening all over the place, not so much locally, though there's some evidence that maybe there was a guy brought in to play in Ottawa for one of the teams there. So finally, we get this reaction in 1868, this creeping suspicion that it's no longer a gentleman's game. It's more about winning than anything else. And this newspaper editor, Decatur, writes, baseball is being killed by the growing custom of employing professionals to do the hard work and play the matches. And this is going to be a recurrent thing, this professionalism. And then finally, the cost of travel. This is going to culminate by the end of 1868 in some major changes. But first, we'll talk about what was fun and the fun they had. And that was this whole institution that Morris really does a great job of analyzing in his book. If you haven't read it, you might want to look it up. It's called But Didn't We Have Fun? which is about baseball nationally in this era. And muffin games take their name from muffin was the slang for a bad player. So if you couldn't catch the ball, if you were slow, if you couldn't hit, chances are you were a muffin. And so these muffin games were games that celebrated ineptitude. And people turned out for these as much, if not more, than for the competitive games. The spirit of the muffin games was, we're just going to have fun. And we're going to laugh at ourselves and each other and glory in this. That was the spirit. You get all sorts of combinations. Doctors against lawyers, lawyers against other lawyers, fat guys against thin guys, married guys versus unmarried guys, clerks of one store versus the clerks of another store, printers versus all sorts of other teams. And they would have this sort of mock buildup. There'd be stories in advance, you know, about all the things that are going to happen and who's going to run out of gas first, and even have special rules, which included setting up alcoholic beverages on the base paths so the teams could, players could get relief. So those were popular. Now, and Morris argues that towards the end of the period, towards 1870 or so, these are a direct reaction to the increasing professionalism and competitiveness. In my period in Illinois, which is a little earlier than that, 1865, 1868, it's more like, let's let everybody get in on the fun. This is too much fun to confine to, the Bloomington Baseball Club and the Peoria Olympics. Let's let the average person come out and play and have a good time, have a laugh, and we'll enjoy it. And there's a whole chapter in there on muffin games and humor. And we don't have time to go into, but there's a lot of humor. Editors had filled a lot of columns with humorous stories about the game. So what happens? Well, I begin the book with the visit of this team in October. This is the Cincinnati Red Stockings in 1869. In October of 1869, if you know or remember anything about the Red Stockings, they, having gone undefeated in the East and the Midwest, they took a train all the way to California and played in San Francisco and places in between and never lost a game. And so on the way back, they stopped in Quincy, which is, for those of you that maybe don't know, it's right there on the Mississippi River on the edge of Illinois. Quincy had to pay to get them to stop, which was not the first. They also, that same season, had to pay Rockford, the Forest Cities, to come down and play them because teams are asking for guarantees. And so and Cincinnati, the Red Stockings are going to play the adult club, the Occidental Senior Baseball Club, which has already been surpassed by the Occidental Juniors, which is their younger club. And this is much ballyhoo. People are encouraged to come from all parts of Western Illinois. The Cincinnati Red Stockings put on quite a show. They're hitting the ball so hard, even foul balls, that they hit two spectators, one an old lady who almost knocks her out. Also, they hit a kid on the sidelines, both of whom survive. They just obliterate the Occidentals, which I use in the book. That is the future. If there was any question left that the game had moved out of the, at least in terms of these organized clubs, out of the Chadwick era into a new, more competitive and eventually professional thing, this proves it. But there were also other touring teams from the East. I think this is it's the Philadelphia. It's a mixture of the Philadelphia Athletics and the Brooklyn Athletics, two other teams. Both of those teams came through Illinois in 1868 and stopped in Bloomington. Why did they stop in Bloomington? Because it was on the main rail line between Chicago and St. Louis. They were making the rounds. They were, I think, three teams, at least three, that came through, and they just obliterated Bloomington. It wasn't even close. And of course, we know that eventually then the Forest City Club, here's Morrisana. Here's another, that looks like, this is the Athletics and the Athletics. Philadelphia, they also came through. It was pretty clear by then, after 1868, and certainly decisively proven in 1869, that your hometown team, despite what the editors have been writing for years, was not going to get better by, quote, practice, practice, practice. That was always their great hope that, well, if our guys just practice more, if they took the game more seriously, they could play on the same level with Chicago or somebody. Well, no, we know that now, right? That athletic skill is not passed out equally, and there are certain levels of high athletic skill that no matter how hard, say, somebody like me would practice, I'm not going to achieve. Well, we know that today. We learned that, right? We learned that in Little League or on high school teams or in softball leagues or whatever. But again, this is sort of new. This is something that is new to their experience. We have the advantage of 20/20 vision, hindsight. They were living through this stuff. There was no precedent for them, so that's going to be a problem. And at the same time, as we saw in Quincy, the Occidental Junior Club was actually better than the Senior Club. And so after 1868, the adult clubs start to disappear and the junior clubs take center stage, and those games are much more competitive. And this is where we get the incidents of people booing the umpire. In one case, a game between Springfield and Quincy for the so-called junior championship. There was no tournament or anything. They just decided it was going to be a junior championship. The umpire, who was a former president of the Illinois State Baseball Association and a founder of the Bloomington Baseball Club, and an excellent player who'd been umpiring all over the state of Illinois, at the end of the game, he stepped out on the field and, as was sometimes the case, would give some remarks. And his remarks were, "I've never been so insulted in my life. This has never been done. To accuse me of," and that whole game is covered also in the book. If you want to know more, I'll be happy to answer questions. So by 1870, all the adult clubs are gone. The Chicago Excelsiors fold their tent at the end of 1868. In 1870, some Chicago wealthy people deciding that Chicago has to have a baseball team to uphold its image, create something called the Chicago White Stockings. And I know you hardcore fans will know what team is the modern day successor of the Chicago White Stockings, who just happened to replace their manager I saw today, not the team that has the name White Stockings. And then we know that Forest City goes on to play at least 1 year, maybe two, in the National Association before realizing that we don't have the population base to support a major league team. This is one of the pictures. This is James T. Cunningham from the Centralia Egyptians. Got a great local historian down there named Steve Loomis, who made my job easier for me when it came to Centralia. So this is his uniform. This was probably taken in 1867. Look at the size of that bat. He's got a medallion around his neck. This may have been a medal they won in Decatur, or it may, and then his hand is probably a gilded baseball, which the team also won in 1867 in Decatur. Notice the cross bats on his sleeve. These, I don't know if these are the slippers or if these were the shoes, but the long pants. Centralia, they played right here. This is this wasn't here. This is the Central. It's called Library Park. And it's one of the few places that you could go today and play baseball on a field that was used in the 1860s. I wouldn't advise it today because there's sidewalks. You're going to knock out the library windows, but it's one of the places you can do that at. There's a handful. There are also some great players. This is the Babe Ruth. Before Babe Ruth was born, there was a Babe Ruth in Pana, Illinois. J.C. McQuigg, another Irish immigrant, this one from Northern Ireland, who was noted for hitting home runs and putting infielders, especially in risk of their lives, at the ball so hard. This is Senator Fred Du Bois. He is the son of our old friend Jesse Du Bois, who created Railway Park. Fred is was the only person at the time to serve as a U.S. Senator from Idaho as both a Republican and later a Democrat. He had great success in his life. Let's see if there's anybody else here. This is another place you can play. If you've been to Decatur and been to Fairview Park, this is that area which now is the football field. A baseball field in Fairview Park, right in the center of the old park. This was the state fairgrounds. There was a racetrack around it. This is where they had the great tournament in September of 1867 that you can blame for putting me into this whole project. Let's see what else we got. And this is where you can find the book. I will try and find some way to get this down. How do we get rid of it? Oh. Okay, that's how we get rid of it. All right. Thank you for your time and attention. I hope for some of you, or for the ones that have heard me before, this was some new information. I try and make each of these different for that reason. But you may have some questions. I went through stuff sort of quickly. Oh, this is this is a modern vintage baseball which approximates the type of ball they would have used. It's been banged around. This is a new one. You can't feel this, but if you felt it, you would think, oh my God, 50 miles an hour, ouch. But that's an example. So I will shut up now and let you do whatever you wish.
All right. Do we have any questions for Bob? Yeah, Jeff, go ahead.
So Bob, it was 2019, you were kind enough to send me a couple pieces you did. The Spirit of Discourse, A Rose, and Fields of Battle. Were these like preliminary to your book? Did you kind of use that as?
Yeah, it started with the Spirit of Discord, because I was trying to why did this tournament in Decatur turn into such a disaster? But then as I went along, I was struck with the question was, well, how did they find playing fields? And then this stuff is coming in. You're not looking at it by topic. It's just you're going through these newspapers and you're writing down what you find. And I realized quickly that, hey, this playing space was another problem. So both of these were journal articles that appeared before the book.
Okay, so you haven't monetized these? I mean, if I was to scan them and make them available to members, would that be okay?
Just don't tell me about it.
Oh no, I don't want to do anything. If it's going to take away from your book, I don't want to do that.
That's what I meant.
Yeah.
Tell me about it. It's not mine. No, that's the top one. Copyright belongs to the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Museum, and they're not
okay.
They have a journal, and the other one's in the Illinois State Historical Society, and I wouldn't worry about it.
I remember you telling me that now. So
especially for SABR members, that's great. Just if people want it, they're interested in reading it. If it'll help them, crank away.
Well, let's just say buy his book, read that, and then if you have further questions, I can send you some of this. How's that?
Yeah, because the book is a broader view, so there's more detail about those two topics in the
right.
Book.
Yeah. Yep. Okay. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jen.
Sure. Thanks. Hey, Bob, I had a question. I was just fascinated by the appendix that had the list of players.
Yep.
Did you keep track of those the whole time? Did you write part of it and kind of go back and think, oh, I should start keeping track of that? Because that had to be quite a bit of work.
Every time I found a game story that had a box score or names, I wrote them down. I could show you. I got four. I think I got 5 ring binders, keeping track of the teams and then who played on them and what years and all that. And so then when I got done, I went through those and tried to find a lot of the time, most of the time, you just have, Smith, Jones. So you had to hope for, a James Smith. I always hoped they were brothers on a team because they would always have to give the first name of each one. So then you got those names, and then you go into the census records and the city directories and try and find them. And that's why I think it's, what is it, about 100 and some players. I should.
There's a bunch.
Yeah, but you think if you've got 1,000 teams, there were probably 10,000 players, and there were probably more than 1,000 teams. I didn't mention this because there are some places that the newspapers never got microfilm, and I suspect there were more teams in southeastern Illinois than we know about, and maybe more teams in western Illinois than we know about, because those were sort of either newspaper deserts or the papers got thrown out in the wind. But yeah, it was a lot of work, but I wanted to do that because one of the questions people have was, well, who was playing the game? And there's this image, well, they're either all, this whole Cooperstown crap that, that is all these farmers. Well, this game, as you guys know, was not born on the farm. It was born in Manhattan. But who was playing? Were they all like the Knickerbockers in New York? Were they all these upper professionals, unprofessional? Well, yeah, but not necessarily all the time. So I was pleased when I found these other occupations in there. So it was a lot of, it took a lot of extra time, but and I had to sort of fight for those appendices. There were people at the press that, oh, we don't want, no, and the list of teams, because there's also the list of all known teams.
Right.
I was thinking someday somebody's going to come along and maybe they're going to have better ideas and they're going to want a place to start. So with that list of teams, which probably is even more now, thanks to Protoball, you'll have a place to start.
Yeah, and the other thing that you mentioned, the kind of the white collar jobs, that's what struck me again and again, looking at the list, business owner, just, yeah, I guess I think I believe the kind of the legend, right? That is, these farm boys coming off of the fields or whatever, but that isn't what you see. It's very fascinating.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm personally going to become a fan of the Sucker State Baseball Club out of Brimfield. I think that's a great one.
Yeah. Oh, well, don't downplay the deadbeats of Ashley. They're all on the Molly Starks, and there was a couple. They're all in there. There's some great names. There's none of the names we would recognize as a modern baseball. They're all these dead Civil War generals or like Excelsior, a poem that was a Longfellow poem, and just fun. And I know that reflects, it's sort of a fun thing.
Mm-hmm.
Well, one quick question that I have, my research is basically more in the traditional dead ball era. So I'm still running into a lot of the issues you're finding at this particular era of, what papers are available. And as you mentioned earlier, newspapers.com is a great resource, but not everything is available there. And I've reached out to local, more small town historical societies, entities like that. Are there any other, you mentioned Protoball as well. Protoball truly helped me out in my very early stages of just finding individual teams. But are there other resources you can point us to online that might provide assistance if we're looking for similar research in different communities or different eras?
Well, yeah, I think by the time you get to the dead ball era, and you probably found this, you have more newspapers that have survived. But if they aren't online, if they haven't been digitized, then you have to go to the microfilm. Now, there's a problem there. I was very lucky because at the time I was doing the research, the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library would circulate those microfilm reels, order them through your local library. And I was able, since I worked at Milliken, that they would come to Milliken, and Milliken and the library agreed that I could take them home. And I bought one of those, big old microfilm readers. Just after I finished my work, the guy who was head of the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library Museum outlawed that. And now you can't, if you want to see that, you have to go to Springfield. But your local library, if it's big enough, might have, or some local libraries might have copies of their newspapers on microfilm. GSA, if I'm trying to figure out what was going on in Danville, just an example, but maybe you have to make a trip to Danville, and look at it in advance. But it's a real tragedy, and I'm hoping that someday the Abraham Lincoln Presidential Library, they fired that guy, by the way. Not even there's another reason, which is sort of funny in and of itself, but I won't go into it. They'll change that policy, because it's my understanding when they sent all that stuff from the U of I, that's where they used to be at the University of Illinois, that was the condition, that it had to be made available to local libraries. So anyway, that'd be a good cause for somebody to take up. But beyond, it's tough. I mean, if you're talking about dead ball and you've got, like, say, a league like the old 3I league or something, you have a smaller thing you're dealing with. Okay, what were the teams? And maybe I can go to those towns and find stuff. Some local libraries are more helpful than others. Centralia was just fantastic. There were others that I'd go in and go out of with nothing new at all.
Great. Well, thank you.
Thank you.
Bob, if I might ask, you in your book, you talk about the financing of some of the team's expenses, and in large part, it seemed to be a result of specific fundraising activities like picnics and dances and stuff like that. What surprised me was I didn't see anything about corporate sponsorships, and I would have expected to see that. I think, in the NFL, the Chicago Bears started as the Decatur Staleys. I grew up in Pekin, and we had a women's softball team, the Pekinlets. They started as the Caterpillar Dieselettes, and I remember that when they played, the best team in the country was the Ray Bestis Brakettes from Connecticut, and they were sponsored by the Ray Bestis Brake Company. And I'm not seeing, well, in men's softball, there was a Toyota team out of Salt Lake City, I think it was, and I would have thought that there would have been businesses in the various communities that would have sponsored teams, and I'm not seeing that. Am I wrong about that? And why not, if that's the case?
That's an excellent question, and I'm glad you asked it, because number one, it's always good to hear from you, Don. Thanks for sitting in on this. You've heard about 5 of these things now, I think, but there were 2. One was the Springfield Capitals, which was essentially, to some degree, sponsored by, certainly in terms of having a playing space, by the Capital Horse Railway Company. But there was one in Peoria which became controversial. The old Olympics team, which was the original team in Peoria, eventually sort of fell apart, and a new team was created named the Fort Clark Bakery. And it was sponsored by, there was a bakery there, the Fort Clark Bakery, and this caused some blowback in the newspaper. It was like, how, this is a strange thing. We have and they actually made some pokes and fun at it. I think that might be somewhere in the book. But those are the only 2 that where they seemed to get, at least openly, they had corporate sponsorship. Well, now, we've got corporations' names on everything. Seems like some places like Centralia were very good at it. They had dances and ice cream socials, in the off season. And, for whatever reason, they were good at it. I think the clubs that weren't were among the first to fall by the wayside, because it's expensive to do that train travel and other expenses. And these guys were getting older, and maybe they were getting married, and the wives say, well, you got other things to do, or they were starting careers or what have you. That was another factor, I think, in undermining the adult club. But certainly it's one of the big differences from today, the lack of corporate sponsorship.
Just in a brief aside for Don, actually the Salt Lake team was sponsored by Larry Miller, who also owned a small franchise called the Utah Jazz. But he was a former softball pitcher, fast pitch pitcher too.
Okay.
Yeah, so he had a bunch of Toyota dealerships, but they actually played out there in '92 when he was hosting. So very nice man.
I jumped on late. Bob, did you talk about the difference in the rules then from what they are now early on?
Yeah,
okay.
We went into that. Yeah.
All right. I would have thought so. And I had difficulty getting on, so I missed that part.
Right. Did we have any other questions?
Oh, I see some stuff here. Oh, there's a question from somebody about, about the first, second, and third baseman are standing on the bases. Is this a practice or rule, or just how? This is this is a big controversy right now in vintage baseball, which is the modern version of this. I think the first baseman I've read tended to play pretty close to the bag, and then it depends on who you want to believe. At some point, either in the late 1860s or 70s, sometimes it's credited to Charlie Comiskey, decided to play farther away. I think that these people are all, you notice that the guys are on the bases and the outfielders are sort of lined up in the center of the field. I think that's more artistic, because that way he could get them, the artist could get them all, show them all. I saw nothing in the rules or nothing in the game stories about people having to play in a fixed position. So I think the Currier and Ives engraving, while very beautiful and very helpful, is probably in error.
Thanks. Right. We've gone a little bit over an hour, so why don't we have any last question for Bob?
I guess I just wanted to ask, what do you have another baseball project coming up after this?
No, I sort of I'm recuperating right now from a decade of baseball. I've got a couple things, but not related to baseball. Maybe I'll get inspired again. But there's so many people doing good work in later periods. Some of whom are on this program right now. And there's a guy, I think in our chapter, Tom Best, who is finishing up a pretty good book on the history of Monmouth baseball. So I'm hoping that some people will sort of pick it up and maybe fill out some stuff I didn't, or as you're doing, do that dead ball stuff. And there's all sorts of stuff there that I think is interesting. And we tend to, for a lot of people, I think it tends to start with Major League Baseball and end with Major League Baseball. But there was always a lot of other baseball being played. So that's a long answer to your question. I'm sorry.
Totally fine.
And thank you all for your time and patience. I just love talking to groups like you, because it's like preaching to the converted. You guys already know most of this stuff, and so I can sort of skip some of the preliminaries and get right into the meat.
I learned a lot more listening than I ever knew before for both of you did talk about a lot of different things this time. So thank you for presenting.
Thank you.
Yep. So let's thank Bob for his time tonight. And in the chat, I put a link to the book at the U of I Press if you want to order a copy. If you're a good librarian like myself, you can also get it at your local library, I suspect. And if they don't have it, make sure they purchase a copy. So thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Hey, can we talk about next month real quick?
Oh, yeah, sure. Please go ahead, Jeff.
So I've got Dave Kindred is going to be our speaker. I think it might be December 4th.
Yeah.
But he's going to be our speaker next month. He's I believe, the only sports writer that's won the Red Smith, the Kurt Gowdy, and the PGA Lifetime Achievement Award. He'll mostly talk about, and he lives in Carlock now, and he just released this memoir about his life in sports writing, and then he's finished it the last 10 years writing about the Morton Lady Potter basketball team. Writes about 500-600 words every game they play. So wonderful man. Lost his wife a little while ago, but he's a Illinois Wesleyan graduate, and in fact, Chad knows this, but all of his prior works are at Wesleyan now. He donated all those to the library, and he wrote a book called, it's really a collection. For 10 years, he was a baseball writer for the Sporting News and published a book called Glove Stories. So I don't know what he's going to talk about for sure, but he's going to talk about, baseball. But, the guy's been to Munich. He covered like 50 Ali fights and knows him personally, or knew him personally. He's been to the Olympics a bunch of times, was a golf writer. So he's a pretty interesting man, but he'll try to tailor this on baseball. But I just want to let you guys know, put it on your calendar if you can. And it'll be Zoom again, correct, Chad?
Yes, it will. And thanks for that reminder. And should go out soon if it isn't already with some of the info.
Great.
Right. Thanks for that reminder, Jeff. And Bob, thanks so much.
Thank you, Bob. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Have a good
Bob.
night.